There's something magical about the way dreams can take flight when you're willing to work for them. Tasha Monroe was living proof of that. She wasn't born into money or privilege. Instead, her childhood was filled with struggles most people wouldn't wish on their worst enemy. But even as a little girl, she had a spark, a fire in her belly that refused to be extinguished. That fire eventually led her to create one of the most successful luxury jewelry brands in the world. Growing up, Tasha learned early on what it meant to hustle. Her family didn't have much, but they made do with what they had. She often found herself sketching designs on scraps of paper during quiet moments at home. Those doodles weren't just random shapes, they were ideas waiting to come alive. Little did she know back then that those sketches would one day turn into dazzling pieces worn by celebrities and high-profile clients around the globe. Her journey wasn't easy, though. Breaking into the luxury market as a black woman came with its own set of challenges. People doubted her abilities, questioned her taste, and underestimated her potential. But Tasha wasn't someone who gave up easily. She worked tirelessly, sometimes pulling all-nighters to perfect her craft. She saved every penny she could, took risks others wouldn't dare to take, and poured her heart into building something meaningful. And then finally, it happened. After years of hard work, Monroe & Co. opened its doors for the first time. Located in the heart of New York City, the flagship store quickly became a symbol of elegance and sophistication. From the moment customers stepped inside, they were greeted by shimmering displays of diamonds, gold, and gemstones, each piece crafted with precision and care. It wasn't just a store, it was an experience. Celebrities flocked to buy her creations, and soon enough, Tasha's name was everywhere. But success didn't change Tasha, not really. Sure, she now traveled in private jets and attended glitzy events, but deep down, she remained the same determined woman who started with nothing. What mattered most to her was the legacy she was creating. She wanted her brand to stand for more than just beautiful jewelry. She wanted it to represent resilience, creativity, and the power of believing in yourself no matter what life throws your way. As her business grew, so did the demands on her time. Between designing new collections, meeting with investors, and managing global expansion, Tasha found herself stretched thin. Running a multi-million-dollar company wasn't easy, especially when you insisted on doing everything yourself. So she decided to hire help. She brought in experienced professionals to handle day-to-day operations, giving her some breathing room to focus on bigger picture goals. One of the key hires was the store manager, a polished individual with years of experience in luxury retail. On paper, he seemed perfect for the job. He spoke confidently about his vision for the store, promised to uphold the brand's values, and assured Tasha that he'd treat every customer like royalty. Trusting his expertise, Tasha handed over the reins, confident that her store was in capable hands. Little did she know this decision would lead to one of the most unforgettable and infuriating moments of her career. But we'll get to that later. For now, let's just say that Tasha had built an empire from scratch, and she deserved every bit of recognition and respect that came with it. Unfortunately, not everyone saw it that way, and sometimes, even the strongest among us need reminders of our worth. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings where the air felt fresh and full of promise. Tasha Monroe decided to visit her flagship store, something she hadn't done in a while. Life had been so busy lately, meetings, travel, and endless deadlines, that she rarely had time to just step back and experience her own creation. She missed the quiet hum of the showroom, the way sunlight caught the edges of diamonds, and the sense of pride that came with knowing she'd built all of this from scratch. That morning, she woke up feeling nostalgic. Maybe it was the cool breeze, or the golden light streaming through her windows, but she wanted to reconnect with her roots. So instead of heading straight to her office, she grabbed her leather jacket, slipped on her favorite sneakers, and made her way to Monroe & Co. It wasn't about checking on employees or reviewing sales figures. It was about remembering why she started this journey in the first place. When she arrived, the store looked as stunning as ever. The glass cases sparkled under soft lighting, and the faint scent of luxury perfume lingered in the air. Everything seemed perfect, or at least it did until she walked inside. That's when things took an unexpected turn. As soon as Tasha stepped through the door, a man behind the counter glanced up. He was tall, sharply dressed, and carried himself with an air of authority. His expression shifted slightly when he saw her, though not in the way she expected. Instead of warmth or recognition, there was a flicker of indifference, a look that said, "Who are you?" "Good morning," he said, his tone polite but distant. "How can I assist you today?" Tasha smiled, brushing off the odd vibe. "Hi, I'm Tasha Monroe," she replied casually. "I thought I'd stop by and see how things are going." The man blinked, his smile faltering for just a second before returning. "Oh, really? Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. At first, Tasha thought maybe he didn't hear her clearly. After all, she wasn't exactly hard to recognize. Her face had been featured in countless magazines and her name was synonymous with the brand. But when she repeated herself, explaining again who she was, his demeanor changed completely. "I'm sorry, but I don't think you understand," he said, his tone firmer now. "This is a high-end establishment. We need to know who we're dealing with before we proceed." Tasha froze, stunned by what she was hearing. Was this really happening? Here she was, standing in her own store, the very place she'd poured her soul into, and being treated like some random visitor trying to sneak past security. For a moment, she wondered if she'd accidentally wandered into the wrong building. But no, this was her store. These were her jewels. And yet, here she stood, invisible. The man didn't stop there. Without waiting for another word from her, he turned away, muttering something about needing to check with someone else. Then, without another glance in her direction, he disappeared into the back room, leaving Tasha standing alone near the counter. For 7 long minutes, nothing happened. Employees bustled around her, attending to other customers, rearranging displays, and chatting among themselves. Not a single person acknowledged her presence. It was as if she were a ghost, floating unnoticed through the space she had created. Each passing second felt heavier than the last. At first, Tasha tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe there was some kind of mix-up. Perhaps the staff was having a bad day, but deep down she knew better. This wasn't about logistics or oversight. It was about perception. In that moment, she realized she wasn't being seen as Tasha Monroe, the CEO and founder of Monroe & Co. She was being judged based on appearances, dismissed because of how she looked and dressed that day. By the time the man returned, clipboard in hand, Tasha's patience was wearing thin. She watched as he approached her, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words hit her like a punch to the gut. "I checked with my team," he said, his voice clipped. "We don't have any record of your visit. I'll need you to leave unless you can provide proper identification." That was the final straw. Enough was enough. Tasha took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. There was no anger in her voice, just calm, undeniable certainty. "You won't find my name on any list," she said, locking eyes with him. "Because I'm Tasha Monroe. This is my store." The room went silent. The man's face drained of color as realization dawned. For a split second, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then, stammering, he began apologizing profusely, stumbling over his words in a desperate attempt to make amends. But Tasha didn't care about apologies. What had just happened wasn't a simple mistake. It was a reflection of deeper issues. And as the owner of the company, she knew she couldn't let it slide. This wasn't just about her, it was about sending a message. 7 minutes might not seem like a lot of time, but in those 7 minutes everything changed. For Tasha, for the man behind the counter, and for the future of Monroe & Co. The clock ticked loudly in Tasha's mind as she stood there rooted to the spot. Each second felt like an eternity, stretching out until it became unbearable. She replayed the scene over and over again in her head, the dismissive tone, the skeptical glances, the way he turned his back on her without a second thought. It wasn't just about being ignored, it was about being erased. In those 7 minutes, she wasn't seen as Tasha Monroe, the woman who had poured her heart and soul into building this empire. Instead, she was reduced to someone who didn't belong, a stranger unworthy of attention. When the man finally returned, clipboard still clutched tightly in his hands, Tasha could see the panic in his eyes. He started apologizing, stumbling over his words, trying to explain himself. But none of it mattered anymore. The damage was done. Those 7 minutes weren't something she could simply brush off or forgive with a handshake. They cut deeper than any insult ever could, because they reminded her of all the times she'd been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed throughout her life. Tasha wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, not when they mattered. And this mattered more than anything else. Her voice remained steady as she looked him straight in the eye and said, "You work for me. This is my store." There was no anger in her tone, just clarity. She didn't need to yell to make her point. Her words carried weight, each syllable landing like a hammer. The man froze, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Around them, the room grew eerily quiet. Employees stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between Tasha and the man, unsure of how to react. Without missing a beat, Tasha pulled out her phone and dialed corporate headquarters. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she connected with her assistant. When the call picked up, she spoke with authority, leaving no room for debate. "Hi, it's me," she said calmly. "I need you to terminate the manager at the flagship store immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone within earshot froze, their faces reflecting a mix of shock, disbelief, and fear. Some employees whispered apologies under their breath, while others simply stared, too stunned to speak. For many of them, this moment was surreal. How often did you witness your boss firing someone right in front of you? And not just any boss, the CEO herself. The manager tried to intervene, his voice cracking as he pleaded for another chance. "Please, I made a mistake. Give me one more opportunity to prove myself," he begged. But Tasha shook her head, her expression firm. "This isn't about giving second chances," she said. "It's about accountability. You failed to recognize your own employer, and worse, you treated a customer, any customer, with disrespect. That's not acceptable." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. There was no room for negotiation. This wasn't just about him. It was about setting a standard. If someone in her position could be treated this way, what did that say about the treatment of others? What message would it send if she let this slide? As the manager packed up his belongings, visibly shaken, Tasha took a moment to address the rest of the staff. She walked slowly around the showroom, making eye contact with each employee. Her presence commanded respect, but her tone was gentle, almost maternal. "I built this company from nothing," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "Every piece of jewelry here represents years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. I didn't get here by cutting corners or tolerating behavior that goes against our values. Respect isn't optional, it's non-negotiable." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "What happened today shouldn't have happened. Not to me, not to anyone. We're in the business of making people feel special, valued, and respected. If we can't do that, then we've lost sight of why we're here." The employees nodded, some looking ashamed, others inspired. For many of them, this was a wake-up call. They realized that working for Monroe & Co. wasn't just about selling luxury items. It was about representing a legacy built on resilience, inclusivity, and excellence. Once the manager left, the atmosphere in the store shifted. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a sense of purpose. Tasha stayed for a while longer, walking through the showroom, touching the displays, and reconnecting with the space. She chatted briefly with a few customers who recognized her, smiling warmly as she thanked them for their support. But despite the smiles, her mind was racing. Those 7 minutes had changed everything, not just for the manager, whose career had come to an abrupt end, but for Tasha, too. She couldn't unsee what had happened. It forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her company, her leadership, and the world she operated in. As much as she wanted to believe that her success had shielded her from discrimination, this experience proved otherwise. By the time she left the store, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the city streets. Tasha climbed into her car, gripping the steering wheel as emotions swirled inside her. Anger, frustration, sadness, they all bubbled to the surface, threatening to overwhelm her. But beneath it all was something stronger: resolve. She knew this incident wouldn't define her, but it would shape her. It would push her to dig deeper, to ask harder questions, and to demand better, not just for herself, but for everyone who stepped foot into Monroe & Co. Because if there was one thing Tasha Monroe understood, it was the power of turning pain into purpose. And that's exactly what she intended to do. The drive home felt longer than usual. Tasha gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she replayed the day's events in her mind. The city lights blurred past her window, but she barely noticed them. Her thoughts were consumed by what had happened at the store, every word, every glance, every second of dismissal. It wasn't just about the manager or his actions, it was about something much bigger, something that went beyond one bad decision or one careless moment. When she finally walked into her apartment, she didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the glittering skyline. The city looked beautiful from up here, peaceful, almost magical, but Tasha couldn't shake the heaviness inside her chest. She kicked off her shoes, sank onto the couch, and pulled her knees to her chest. For the first time all day, she let herself sit quietly with her emotions. At first, there was anger. Raw, unfiltered anger. How dare someone treat her that way? In her own store? After everything she'd sacrificed to get where she was? But beneath the anger was a deeper emotion, one she wasn't ready to face yet. Pain, rejection, a sense of invisibility that cut straight to her core. As the adrenaline faded, Tasha began to think more clearly. She realized this wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated because of how she looked. Growing up, people had doubted her abilities, questioned her ambitions, and dismissed her dreams simply because she didn't fit their idea of success. Back then, she'd used those moments as fuel to push harder, work smarter, and prove everyone wrong. But now, sitting alone in her penthouse, she wondered if proving people wrong was enough. Was it possible to change the system entirely, instead of constantly fighting against it? Her mind wandered back to the employees at the store, the ones who hadn't said a word while she stood there invisible. Had they recognized her but chosen not to speak up? Or had they genuinely not known who she was? Either way, it pointed to a larger issue. If she, the founder and CEO, could be treated this way, what did that mean for other customers? What about the young black women who walked into Monroe & Co. hoping to feel seen and valued? Were they being treated fairly? Or were they facing the same biases she had experienced today? These questions kept circling in her mind, refusing to let her rest. Tasha grabbed a notebook from the coffee table and started jotting down ideas. At first, they were scattered thoughts, fragments of frustration and inspiration, but slowly, they began to take shape. By the time she finished writing, she had a plan. A bold, ambitious plan that would challenge not only her company, but also the industry she worked in. What struck her most was the realization that this wasn't just about fixing one broken link in the chain. It was about rebuilding the entire structure. Hiring diverse staff wasn't enough. Offering training programs wasn't enough. True change required going deeper, changing mindsets, challenging assumptions, and creating spaces where everyone felt welcome and respected. Tasha knew this wouldn't be easy. People resisted change, especially when it forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. Some might accuse her of overreacting or making too big a deal out of one incident. But she also knew that leadership wasn't about taking the easy path. It was about doing what was right even when it was hard. And right now this felt like the right thing to do. She spent hours that night thinking, planning, and reflecting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and she drifted off to sleep, still clutching the notebook. When she woke up the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the room with warmth. For the first time since the incident, Tasha felt a glimmer of hope. Yes, what had happened was painful, but it had also given her clarity. It had shown her exactly where her company, and perhaps the entire industry, needed to grow. That morning, she called an emergency meeting with her executive team. She laid out her vision, sharing not only what had happened but also why it mattered. She spoke passionately about the need for accountability, representation, and inclusivity, not as buzzwords, but as guiding principles. To her relief, her team listened. They asked questions, shared their own experiences, and offered suggestions. By the end of the meeting, they were aligned on one thing: Monroe & Co. needed to lead by example. Over the next few weeks, Tasha threw herself into implementing changes. She started with mandatory diversity training for all employees, emphasizing the importance of treating every customer with dignity and respect. She also introduced workshops designed to help staff recognize unconscious bias, a concept many weren't familiar with but quickly embraced once they understood its impact. But Tasha didn't stop there. She wanted to go beyond internal policies and create real, lasting impact. So she launched a mentorship program aimed at supporting aspiring entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. Through this initiative, participants would receive guidance, resources, and networking opportunities to help them succeed in the luxury retail space. It was her way of paying forward the lessons she'd learned along the way. One evening, as she reviewed the progress reports from her team, Tasha found herself smiling. Despite the challenges, she felt proud of what they were building together. This wasn't just about repairing damage, it was about creating something better, something stronger, something that reflected the values she'd always stood for. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. What if people thought she was overstepping? What if critics accused her of using the incident as a publicity stunt? These fears lingered in the back of her mind, but she refused to let them dictate her actions. She reminded herself why she'd started this journey in the first place: to build a legacy that inspired others. And if that meant ruffling a few feathers along the way, so be it. By the time she turned off her laptop and headed to bed that night, Tasha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be smooth, but she was ready for it. She had faced adversity before, and she'd come out stronger every time. This was no different. In fact, it might just be the beginning of her greatest chapter yet. Change isn't easy, especially when it challenges the way things have always been done. But Tasha wasn't interested in doing things the old way anymore. The incident at the store had opened her eyes to a harsh reality, one she couldn't ignore even if she wanted to. So instead of sweeping it under the rug or pretending it didn't happen, she decided to use it as a catalyst for transformation. This wasn't just about fixing what went wrong. It was about creating something entirely new. Tasha knew that real change started from within. It wasn't enough to slap a fresh coat of paint on the walls and call it progress. She needed to dig deeper, to address the root causes of the problem and rebuild her company culture from the ground up. That's why she announced sweeping reforms designed to make Monroe & Co. a beacon of inclusivity, respect, and opportunity. The first step was education. Tasha introduced mandatory diversity training for every employee, from sales associates to senior management. These sessions weren't your typical corporate lectures filled with buzzwords and empty promises. Instead, they focused on real-life scenarios, open discussions, and actionable steps employees could take to create a more welcoming environment. Trainers encouraged staff to share their own experiences, both good and bad, and talk openly about how bias and prejudice affected their daily lives. For some employees, these conversations were eye-opening. Many admitted they hadn't realized how certain behaviors or assumptions might unintentionally alienate customers or coworkers. Others shared stories of times they'd felt excluded or judged because of who they were. By the end of each session, participants walked away with a better understanding of not just what needed to change, but also why it mattered. But Tasha didn't stop there. She knew that true representation went beyond hiring diverse staff. It meant giving people a seat at the table where decisions were made. So, she restructured her leadership team to ensure voices from different backgrounds were heard and valued. She promoted several employees who had previously been overlooked, bringing fresh perspectives into key roles. And she implemented blind recruitment processes to eliminate unconscious bias during hiring. These changes didn't go unnoticed. Customers began commenting on the shift in energy at Monroe & Co. Stores felt warmer, friendlier, and more inclusive. People noticed that employees seemed genuinely invested in making them feel welcome, regardless of their appearance, race, or socioeconomic status. Sales numbers reflected this positive shift too. More customers were walking through the doors and staying longer. Word spread quickly, turning Monroe & Co. into a brand synonymous not just with luxury, but also with humanity. Still, Tasha wanted to do more. She believed that success wasn't just about building wealth for herself or her company, it was about lifting others up along the way. Inspired by her own struggles as a young entrepreneur, she launched a mentorship program aimed at helping aspiring business owners from marginalized communities break into industries traditionally closed off to them. Through this initiative, participants received hands-on guidance, financial support, and access to networks they might otherwise never encounter. One of the most impactful aspects of the program was its focus on storytelling. Tasha encouraged mentees to share their journeys, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. She hosted events where these stories were told, allowing audiences to connect with the human side of entrepreneurship. For many attendees, hearing these raw, authentic narratives was life-changing. It reminded them that success wasn't reserved for a select few. It was possible for anyone willing to put in the work. Tasha also took her message to a wider audience by launching a public campaign called See Me, Hear Me. The campaign used social media, interviews, and community events to amplify the voices of those often ignored or dismissed in the luxury world. It wasn't just about showcasing beautiful jewelry. It was about celebrating the beauty of resilience, diversity, and self-expression. Videos featured everyday people sharing their dreams, fears, and triumphs, while posts highlighted the importance of seeing beyond stereotypes. The response was overwhelming. Supporters praised Tasha for her courage and transparency, calling her efforts inspiring and long overdue. Some critics accused her of being overly political or seeking attention, but Tasha brushed off their comments. She knew that no matter what anyone said, her actions spoke louder than words. Every piece of jewelry sold, every employee trained, and every mentee supported was proof that she was committed to making a difference. As the months passed, Monroe & Co. evolved into more than just a retail brand. It became a movement, a symbol of hope and possibility for anyone who had ever felt invisible or unworthy. Employees took pride in working for a company that stood for something greater than profit margins. Customers returned not just for the products, but for the sense of belonging they felt when they walked through the doors. For Tasha, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she was asking too much or pushing too hard. But then she'd remember the faces of the people she'd met along the way. The young woman inspired to start her own business, the elderly customer who finally felt seen after years of feeling overlooked, the employee who broke down in tears during a training session because someone finally heard their story. Those moments reminded her why she kept going. By the time the year came to a close, Monroe & Co. was thriving in ways Tasha had never imagined. Sales soared, partnerships flourished, and the brand's reputation reached new heights. But none of that compared to the personal fulfillment she felt, knowing she'd created something meaningful. What started as a painful experience had transformed into an opportunity to redefine not only her company, but also her legacy. Looking back, Tasha realized that the incident at the store wasn't just a low point, it was a turning point. It forced her to confront uncomfortable truths and pushed her to become the leader she was always meant to be. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly have its bumps, she faced it with confidence, knowing she was building a future where everyone had a chance to shine. Months had passed since the day Tasha stood invisible in her own store. What began as a painful and humiliating experience had transformed into a powerful movement, one that redefined not only her company, but also her purpose. The changes she implemented weren't just about fixing what went wrong. They were about creating something lasting, something that would outlive her. And as she looked around at the impact of her efforts, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Monroe & Co. was no longer just a jewelry brand, it was a symbol of hope, resilience, and empowerment. Customers from all walks of life walked through its doors, knowing they'd be treated with respect and dignity. Employees felt valued, not just for their work, but for who they were as individuals. The store's energy buzzed with positivity, a stark contrast to the tension that once lingered in the air. People didn't come here just to buy jewelry. They came to feel seen, heard, and celebrated. The mentorship program Tasha launched became one of the most rewarding aspects of her journey. She watched as young entrepreneurs, many of whom reminded her of herself at their age, blossomed under guidance and support. One mentee, a single mother juggling 2 jobs while pursuing her dream of starting a skincare line, brought tears to Tasha's eyes when she gave her first presentation. Another, a recent college graduate with big ideas but little confidence, surprised everyone by securing funding for his eco-friendly fashion startup. These stories filled Tasha with joy, reminding her why she started this initiative in the first place. Her public campaign, See Me, Hear Me, continued to gain momentum, reaching audiences far beyond what she'd imagined. Social media posts featuring real people sharing their struggles and triumphs resonated deeply with viewers. Comments poured in from fans thanking Tasha for giving them a platform to share their voices. Some even shared how the campaign inspired them to pursue dreams they'd long abandoned. It wasn't uncommon for Tasha to receive heartfelt messages from strangers telling her she'd changed their lives. But perhaps the most profound change happened within Tasha herself. The incident at the store forced her to confront parts of her identity she'd spent years trying to ignore. Growing up, she'd learned to downplay her race, her gender, and her background in order to succeed in spaces that weren't built for people like her. For so long, she believed blending in was the key to acceptance. But now, standing firmly in her power, she realized the opposite was true. Embracing who she was and using her platform to uplift others was the greatest act of strength she could offer. One evening, after wrapping up a busy day of meetings, Tasha found herself back at her flagship store. It was late, and the showroom was empty, bathed in soft golden light. She wandered through the space, running her fingers over the glass cases and pausing to admire the pieces inside. Each design told a story, not just of craftsmanship and luxury, but of perseverance and possibility. As she stood there, she thought about the countless hours she'd spent sketching ideas, sourcing materials, and perfecting every detail. This store represented more than just her hard work. It represented her heart. A memory surfaced, unbidden but vivid. She remembered the early days when she worked out of a tiny studio apartment, piecing together necklaces on her kitchen table. Back then, success felt like a distant dream, something she chased, but never quite believed she'd catch. Yet here, she was, standing in the middle of her empire, surrounded by evidence of everything she'd overcome. It was surreal, almost overwhelming. As she gazed at the glittering displays, Tasha smiled softly. She thought about the manager who had dismissed her, the employees who hadn't recognized her, and the customers who might have walked away feeling unseen. None of those moments defined her or her company anymore. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she'd come and how much further she could go. The next morning, Tasha woke up with renewed clarity. She decided to write an open letter to the world, sharing her story in full detail. In it, she talked about the pain of being invisible, the frustration of facing bias, and the determination to turn adversity into action. But she also spoke about forgiveness, not for those who had wronged her, but for herself. She forgave herself for doubting her worth, for internalizing the judgments of others, and for letting fear hold her back for so long. When the letter went live, it spread like wildfire. Readers praised her honesty and vulnerability, calling her words inspiring and relatable. Journalists reached out for interviews, asking her to elaborate on her journey and vision. At first, Tasha hesitated. She didn't want to appear self-serving or overly dramatic, but eventually she agreed. If sharing her story could inspire even one person to keep going, she knew it would be worth it. In one particularly memorable interview, the host asked Tasha what advice she'd give to someone facing similar challenges. Her response was simple, yet profound. Don't let anyone dim your light. You are worthy exactly as you are. Keep showing up, keep speaking up, and trust that your voice matters. Those words echoed across platforms, becoming a rallying cry for people everywhere. They appeared on social media posts, protest signs, and motivational posters. Even celebrities joined the conversation, sharing how Tasha's message resonated with them personally. It was humbling and empowering to see her story touch so many lives. As time went on, Tasha continued to expand her mission. She partnered with organizations focused on education, economic empowerment, and racial equity, funneling resources and attention toward causes close to her heart. She traveled the world, meeting with communities often overlooked by mainstream industries and listened intently to their needs and dreams. Everywhere she went, she carried the lessons she'd learned, the importance of visibility, representation, and compassion. Years later, when historians wrote about Tasha Monroe, they wouldn't focus solely on her business achievements. Yes, she revolutionized the luxury retail industry and built a global empire from scratch. But more importantly, she showed the world what it meant to lead with authenticity and purpose. She proved that success wasn't just about wealth or fame. It was about leaving behind a legacy that made life better for others. On a quiet afternoon, Tasha sat in her garden, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Her phone buzzed nearby, notifications lighting up the screen, but she ignored them. For now, she simply wanted to sit in stillness, reflecting on the road she'd traveled. There had been highs and lows, victories and setbacks, but through it all, she remained steadfast in her belief that everyone deserved a chance to shine. As darkness fell and stars began to twinkle in the sky, Tasha felt a deep sense of peace. She had built something extraordinary, not just for herself but for generations to come. And though the journey was far from over, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.